Hello, my friends, and Happy New Year. Well, 2020 is now officially done. I bet you are all glad. I am too, but for a different reason. I think 2020 was one awful year. It showed the worst of humanity, but not in the way you're thinking, or like what you're probably thinking. If I had to give an animal like the Chinese do, like each year, like the year of the dragon, year of the dog, year of the pig, etc. If I had to give an animal for this year, I would call it the year of the goat, the scapegoat. What do I mean by that? Well, a big part of the reason why this year was so awful was because of how much it showed a man's tendency to scapegoat problems. And I wanted to discuss, in retrospect, the problems we have with scapegoating. Whether we give blame to people who have no blame or give all blame to people who only have a little bit of blame. So I wanted to discuss this here in this Ramble video. Thank you very much for listening. The first subject I want to talk about in all of this would be coronavirus scapegoats. Because pretty much for, I'd say, 3/4 of the year, it has been focused completely on this coronavirus, at least here in America. As I speak, I'm only giving context from an American's point of view, as I don't know how things in like Belgium are doing. In the Belgium, how places like Belgium are doing on the ground. All I can do is search for stuff on the internet. But I can tell you what's going on here in America. There are three big things we scapegoat for the coronavirus. The first one would be President Trump. Now, this is not to say his response has been perfect, but the issue is a lot of people put the blame for America's failure squarely on his doorstep. Now, that makes sense to anybody who does not know how our government works. Basically, if there's a failure evenly across the board, then it's probably a federal failure. For instance, the Great Depression was a federal failure as it affected every state pretty evenly. Is that the case for Corona? No, not even close. There, in America, we have states that had some of the worst responses in the world to Corona, but we also had states that had some of the best response in the world to Corona. That doesn't really add up if it's a complete federal failure. Of course, not to say there wasn't federal failure. Um, I believe that the lockdown was premature from Trump, considering that the places that had it worst, even at that time, already locked down. I also think that this stimulus stuff from President and Congress has been awful as well. Either open it back up or cut out pork and just give small businesses money. Instead, we want to supply Nancy Pelosi's ice cream fridge and salons. So this is not to say that Trump is absolved of any blame, but to claim that he is the sole reason or the major reason for it, it does not add up when you understand how our government works and the discrepancy in the responses of states. Speaking of states, one thing we do is scapegoat other states for some states' problems. When you look at much of the media, it seems like you would think that Florida had the worst response. Is that true? No, not even close. New York has the second worst death rate. New Jersey has the worst. Where does Florida reside? Well, New York has I think 182 per 100,000, and New Jersey has 202 per 100,000. What does Florida have? 92 per 100,000. It's impossible to say that Florida is doing worse than New York by any stretch of imagination. Instead, we blame other states for other states' problems. When basically we ignore places like New York and California's failures and say that it's the people in Florida that are the big problem. And that's another thing we do. We scapegoat people. Bill de Blasio, I'm gonna call him by his real name, Wilhelm, the name will make sense when I say this, is scapegoating Jews in New York, and I'll get to that a little later. Basically, we blame people we think are the reason for the virus, and not the people where it's affecting. Let's just say in California, it's the LA County, or LA City mostly, that's having the big reaction. Not exactly a hick-town MAGA country, if you will. And of course, the big scapegoat we do is anyone other than China. There's no way to beat around the bush. China is the reason this is happening. The only reason people aren't blaming China is because they get something from it. I call it LeBron James effect. You don't say anything bad about China as long as they pay your bills. And that's the big problem right now that not only big rich people have, but smaller people like you and me have. I refuse to, as long as I am aware of it, to buy from China if I'm able to and if I can. For instance, you are watching this on an HP computer, a webcam. If HPs are made in China, then I certainly should find a new company, as I am searching for a laptop at the time of this recording. I also have a Samsung phone as opposed to an Apple phone. Again, I believe Samsung is Korean. The biggest problem I want to convey here is that we blame others for China's failures. I know that China at one point blamed us for the virus, claiming that we gave it to them, and then they blamed India, claiming that they gave it to them. It's like, no, this is your fault. You need to pay. Unfortunately, that's probably not going to happen under a Biden presidency. Alright, the second category of scapegoating I want to talk about are groups of people. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I mean groups of people that they claim are the big reason for the virus spread, when logic and statistics shows the opposite. Like, for instance, as an example, very often we blame religious conservatives for the reason why certain charities aren't done, even though statistics show the opposite is true. Religious conservatives give a much higher percentage to charities than more progressive liberals. And that's what I want to talk about. The people we blame are often not only no hindrance, but actually helps to a problem. And to clarify, I am not talking about the coronavirus specifically here. But I kinda am. But not really. I'll explain. First, the group of people we need to stop scapegoating are the pro-life people, like me. Very often we hear, well, the only reason kids go to bed hungry are because pro-life people are stuck up in their ways and don't want to give to charity. No. Studies show that pro-life religious people tend to give way more to charities than more progressive people. Pro-life people adopt way more kids than pro-choice people. Yeah, you've probably heard the argument, well, if you're really pro-life, then you should adopt all the kids. All the kids. It's like, we kind of do. It's your people who need to pick up the slack. Basically, when it comes to charities, pregnancy help, pretty much anything you think of, it's generally pro-life people leading the way. While pro-choice people's first response is to just get rid of the baby. And like I said, if you don't feel like abortion is a bad thing, that's one thing. Okay, we can have a discussion on that. But don't blame pro-life people for the failures of your own community. Another common scapegoat we get, not just this year, but in the last several years, would be Christians in general. Very often, people will blame pretty much any problem on the Christians. Whether it be economic failures, human rights failures, etc., etc., etc. It's generally blamed on Christians. And this has been amplified by the coronavirus. In numerous states right now, churches are being closed down to help prevent the spread of the virus. This obviously doesn't matter, nor does it make sense when you consider that the worst places that have the worst reactions aren't exactly, as I've said before, highly religious areas. Very often they say, well, Christians deny science, even though it's not a Christian area that does it. In fact, if you look at the worst responses to the coronavirus, it is clearly much more progressive areas. The best way to illustrate what I mean by this is look at the Chaz/Chop incident like a year ago. If that were a country, per capita, it would have been one of the most violent countries. Again, not at all a Christian area. In fact, I would even call it an anti-Christian area. The moral of the story is, when a problem happens, don't blame the Christians, because it's more than likely there's a better chance than not that it's the Christians that are either helping the problem or at least prevent it from getting worse. The next scapegoat I want to talk about is white people. Now I know this sounds kind of weird coming from someone who's, I would say, I think 7/8 white or 6/8 white. I don't know. My genealogy is a little weird. On my great grandmother on both sides of my family are full blood natives. So I'm not sure that makes me 1/8, 1/16. I'm not sure how that all works. I think it makes me 1/8 or possibly even 1/4 or 1/16. I don't know. Anybody who's a genealogist, please comment down below what that makes me. But moral of the story is I'm probably mostly white. Now, before you click off this video, I'm not here to say that whites haven't caused problems. Whites clearly have. I'm not gonna say we, but whites clearly have. Obviously, problems like slavery and I guess civil rights violations is what you would call it in the 50s before civil rights movement, were clearly the fault of, I would say, mostly, if not all, fully white people. The big issue right now is that we blame white people in general, for the problems that we have in America. And the issue here is that only works until you scrutinize that a little better, and I'll explain. First off, when I say I believe that we should lay some of the blame on white people, but that's too vague. Portland, for instance, has a lot of racial and homeless problems, and it is run by whites, but not just whites. There should be a word before the whites, and I would say that's progressive. It's progressive whites that are a big problem. Another thing is that you say, well, white people contribute to systemic racism. And while I do believe to an extent there is systemic racism, very often we make it too broad, and the broad definition does not hold to scrutiny, and I'll explain. First off, when we talk about income or jobs, we have to look at the demographics. And what do they say? Well, when it comes to income, if you're an Asian man or woman, Indian man or woman, Nigerian man or woman, you are gonna make more money than the average white person. In fact, the top 10 poorest counties in America are white counties. And while I know that statistics is a little misleading, it still shows that if there was broad systemic racism, that would not be the case. And of course, the biggest problem with that claim is places like Baltimore. I forgot who said it, some kind of political pundit, but I think during the Mike Brown case, was that Baltimore? I think it was. But during the Mike Brown case, one pundit I heard that made me think about this was, we had a black president with a black AG, with a black cop, with a black jury, with a black district attorney, who all said that the cop who killed him was innocent. Where's the racism? And that is hardly the only case, as I would say that very often the biggest problem is that we blame whites when there's really no way to do it. Like, you cannot look at that Baltimore case and say, oh yeah, it was a white person, when white people had nothing to do with it. No race had anything to do with it. And very often, whites do the same thing. We can't say, I've seen it where, like in Portland, I think there was a case a couple years ago in Portland, where we wanted to blame where white supremacists wanted to blame like the Jews or something. And it's like, non-Jewish white people run Portland. How on earth are we going to blame for that? The moral of the story is, let's stop blaming people for where they just don't fit in. They just don't fit in it. It's like, I can't. When George Floyd was tragically killed, he was killed mostly because of a law that the Minneapolis City Council passed. Well, why are you blaming me? I don't live in Minneapolis. I had no control over that law. So, like I said, basically, let's stop scapegoating people where they aren't. And of course, the last group I want to talk about is the Jews. This one is kind of an ironic one, considering that the people who claim that they are for the Jews are often the worst culprits. Right now, Bill de Blasio, real name William Wilhelm, like the Nazi general. For those of you who are offended by that, like, we had a media call Trump a Nazi. I think you handle a little bit of me calling an actual Jew hater Nazi. But basically, what happened is he's shutting down Jewish synagogues, and then not giving the not prioritizing old Jews or old people in general for the coronavirus vaccine. And it's like, that is grade A Nazi scapegoating. Because New York had the worst, and I mean by far the worst response to this. Well, not by far. I guess New Jersey had it worse. But one of the worst responses to this, one of his first thing was blame the Jews. And it's like, no. There's no way you can blame the Jews for places that had spikes where they just simply aren't where there simply aren't Jews. It's like, that doesn't make any sense. 192 deaths per capita is because of the Jews. That sounds a lot like the reasoning a certain person in the 1940s made. Like, let's learn from history. Stop scapegoating people where they do not fit, where they just simply are not. When we do that, we chase ghosts and we don't solve any problems. One type of scapegoating would be general hypocrisy. And this year we had seen the biggest and most hypocritical type of people I have seen in my lifetime. I want to talk about 3 short areas in that too. First off, it would be the Me Too movement, specifically the Harris-Biden support. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, basically what I mean is people, especially young people, drop their standards so quickly for the most convenient reasons that we become what we claim to hate. Kamala Harris went on a tirade about how Joe Biden was a rapist, but she believed him around the time he picked her for VP. Apparently, she didn't even believe it. Obviously, either she didn't believe it, and she was using Me Too as a bolster, or she did believe it, and she's choosing to ignore victims just so she can get into power. This should not be okay to anybody serious in the Me Too movement. Obviously, you have to do some major gymnastics that even Simone Biles would call extreme to claim that you can still support the Me Too movement and Kamala Harris. Another thing is the leaders of the COVID lockdowns. It's hard to take the lockdown seriously when you have the Chicago mayor, the LA mayor, the California governor, and the Rhode Island governor all blatantly ignoring their own lockdown rules. The Chicago mayor was celebrating in the streets that Biden won, or at least Biden won. LA mayor was going to, I think, Connecticut to be at a restaurant where his friends are. Meanwhile, restaurants are going out of business in California en masse. You had the California governor, Newsom, who closed all businesses down except a winery that he just happened to own. What are the odds? And the Rhode Island governor being seen dining with numerous people without a mask. It is hard for people like me and people in general who know about this and who are honest with themselves to assume that the lockdowns are important when the leaders don't even think they're important. And of course, you have people still scapegoating, like Trump, saying that I've literally seen a couple years say that Trump is the reason these people are doing it. That makes no sense whatsoever. Another thing is political inconsistency all around. And this is really more broad, not just in 2020. But in that sense, we need to be more consistent. We can't say that Trump calling the press fake news is akin to the Nazis, and then ignore it when we elect a president whose boss, Obama, threw more reporters in prison than all other presidents combined. Unless you want to somehow claim that calling them fake news is worse than throwing them in prison. It's like, just be consistent. That's all we're asking. I know why people can't, because in many cases, a lot of our political leaders are all the same. And that's the big issue. They're all the same and no one wants to admit it. The last thing I want to talk about is I want to address Christians like myself. The big thing I want to talk about is general Christian cowardice. What do I mean by that? We need to stop being afraid to spread the gospel. Yes, there will be people who reject it. There will be people who probably vigorously reject it. There will be people who violently reject it. But considering that we know what their fates are if we don't do anything, we need to realize that is not that bad. We may lose friends over it. We may be thrown in jail because of it. Who knows? But we need to stop being afraid. We need to tell them what Jesus offers. We need to tell them what he can do for us. It will be rejected by most because on the surface, it is not an attractive offer. Leave behind the things that you love to do, or you'll be sent to hell. That doesn't sound good to some people. But it is important to talk about them, because if we believe what we believe, there should be no price that's not worth paying to get them that message, which I try to do, and I need to improve on it myself. That does not mean we should be pushy or we should be judgmental. In fact, I say we need to, as a particular song that I like, need to put down our signs, cross over the lines, and love like Jesus did. It can be hard, and I don't even do it perfectly myself, not even close, but we need to spread the word with the urgency we know it has. For me, the biggest fear is not the atheists or the people of the other religions. I fear the most for what I would call the progressive Christians or the spiritualists, the ones who will kind of say, well, I'm good. I don't need to be a Christian per se. I'm just good, so good people go to heaven. The issue here is that we need to remind them that none of us are good people. I'm not good, and you're not good. No one gets to heaven because they are good. What does it take you to heaven? Well, my favorite story about that would be Jesus Christ on the cross with the two thieves. That is how you get to heaven. Ultimately, we need to stop being afraid because we have a job to do, and we need to do it. Now, 2020 was not that bad of a year in retrospect. In fact, the only reason it seems so bad is because we had so good so far in the 21st century. A lot of people scoff at that, but we really did. First off, in the 1980s, we had the Cold War scares. A lot of people were so afraid that the world was going to end in nuclear hellfire. We had World War II, which was a complete test of humanity, as well as the most barbaric time in human history. And I find that ironic that we claim that moral evolution is inevitable when it clearly is not. In the 1930s, we had the Great Depression, and we survived that. 1920s, we had a pandemic that makes this one look like child's play. And then I'm not even getting to slavery or the founding of America, or even well before America's time. It was really bad. So one way we can fight depression and all this is to realize that it really isn't that bad right now. There's a good chance that you're living even and I say this as someone who is not living in the best conditions with the best financial stability right now. You are probably, if you're able to watch this, are probably living much better than most kings did back 1,000+ years ago. That is, of course, not to say it's bad, nor is it to discredit your discomfort. I am having trouble as well with this lockdown. It's starting to affect me too, so I can sympathize. As they say, we're in this together. But one thing that's helping me is two things. One, I still have a purpose to fulfill, through Jesus Christ. And two, this will pass, and 2020 has not been that bad in retrospect. Well, that is my final thoughts on 2020. I hope that 2021 brings better fortunes. I think in some ways it will, and in some ways it won't. But we'll have to see. Maybe it'll be a great year. I don't know. But I will continue to pray and continue to do what I do, regardless of the outcome. Well, if you made it to the end of this video, I thank you very much for watching. If you like my videos, please subscribe to the channel. Like the video, click the notification bell to be notified when I post videos. Comment down below any subjects you want me to ramble on, and please follow me on Twitter. Thank you very much for watching. Happy New Year, and God bless.